Hey, this is Rob. I promised at one point that I would make a video describing how I built my cob oven, so here it is. This is what it looks like now, except for some smoke stains on the front from using it. But I'll show you all the stages that it's gone through. The initial idea was to make this oven in my backyard and be able to invite people over to bake bread, people who know more about baking than I do, kind of steal their knowledge, have neighbors and friends hang out, that kind of thing. The other idea was to kind of use just materials that I could find, kind of as an experiment in just using discards and waste from our culture and just figure out a way to make it useful. So with that in mind, there was this restaurant being torn down in my neighborhood, and that's where a lot of this rubble that you see came from, and that became the foundation for the oven. So that was the start of just finding stuff. There's a 4-foot diameter hole here. It's only a few inches deep. We don't really have frost in Florida. If it was in the Northeast, we'd have to have enough of this river rock here to create a barrier between the frost line and the foundation of the oven, so that the cold wouldn't creep up through it. So on the left, there's a 4-foot diameter piece of plywood that I just found in the front of somebody's house, cut into a circle so that I could just use it as a template here and there. I started out just taking those pieces. There was literally a ton of that stuff, and so this is a very small amount of what I had. And the idea was, I could break it apart and make it fit what I needed, or dig through the pile and find a piece that would work. So I started out trying to just make it these kind of solid layers and build it up that way. That wasn't a good idea. I think this one that you're looking at, I took apart and started again, or this might be just the bottom layer. But eventually I realized that I'd have to make it more like a well, so hollow in the middle, and then fill it later with rocks and more of this rubble and gravel and stuff. So here it is, starting to look more like a hollow well. At the same time, I was also collecting bottles, wine bottles. Turned out the easiest way to do that was to go behind the drink wine and paint pictures place, and they had a lot of the same bottles, so that was good. I was looking for wine bottles that were about the same diameter, and those would become insulation later. You'll see that in a minute. So here's the foundation kind of fully built. And then on the top, I have some river rock under that wood piece to kind of make it level. So I just plopped that piece of wood on top and put a level on there, and it looked like it was about flat. And the next step was to take that flat surface and start building a couple of rings of brick. And this will hold that wine bottle insulation. The idea is that with an oven like this, you put fire inside the oven, heat everything up, and there's such a mass of clay that gets hot and stores heat. You pull the fire out, and then you can bake for a very long time. And part of the reason why you can bake for so long is because there's insulation to keep the heat in that massive clay. And so there's a hearth floor for the oven, and that's where the fire is actually sitting on that hearth. It gets transmitted to a big thermal mass of clay that's underneath there, and you'll see that in a moment. And then the idea is to keep the heat in that thermal mass. So here is where we put some insulation to try and keep that heat from leaving the thermal mass and making its way down into the foundation where we can't use it for cooking. So here's the flat surface and 2 layers of bricks. Those were bricks that I think came from my friend Kevin's house when he was tearing down his chimney. So this is more found stuff. At the same time, I had to start figuring out what the building material would be. So the way the whole oven essentially is built and the insulation is using a mixture of clay and sand. That's cob. So at times you add something else like straw maybe, but for the most part it's just sand, water, and clay. So I started by thinking that I would just dig clay out of the ground. There's lots of clay around here, but as I started to do that, I realized that some things that I thought were clay were maybe more silt than clay. In the end, I thought, I'm investing so much time and energy into this, I wanted to make sure that I had something that was actually a good building material. And it turns out it just costs like $25 for a ton, literally, like a cubic yard of this material that's used to make foundations for buildings. And so it's already a mixture of clay and sand. And instead of actually trying to figure out the proper mixture of sand and clay, I just used it straight the way it was. And it turned out that made a pretty good brick. So here I just made a test mold, kind of packed some in there, let it dry, and then squeezed it really hard with my fingers. Almost all of this knowledge that I have in making this comes from Kiko Denzer's book on making cob ovens. And so this is a test that he recommends. And it actually took a lot to break these bricks. So these didn't just crack. This is, right before I threw them away, I kind of beat them up a lot. I will say, though, that the entire project, I was using this mixture of clay and sand that I don't think was quite right. And you'll see I had a couple problems. I think it really needed a lot more sand. But at the time, this seemed really promising. So I took that mixture, that building mix, the mud that I'd be using through the whole process, mixed it with a lot more water to turn it into this kind of yogurt-like consistency, and then mixed it with this bin of chain. It's basically like it's not necessarily sawdust, but it came from a sawmill nearby. And so it's kind of like the stuff that's left over from sawing wood. I wouldn't call it sawdust. It's pretty gritty, and there's some chunky stuff in there. So the idea is to take that empty recess, two bricks high, and put a layer on the bottom of this new insulation mixture. And this is where the wine bottles rest. So the wine bottles are insulation, not necessarily because of the glass, but because they're holding a volume of air. So air is a pretty good insulator. So you've got basically this big air cushion underneath the thermal mass that comes next, and this is to keep all that heat from leaving. The next step, if you ignore this contraption that's on top of there, you can see I've filled that layer of bottles with a bit more insulation, put insulation between the bottles, and then a little bit on top, just barely covering them, so you can see a little bit of the bottles poking out. And if you look at the edges, you can see I'm almost up to that height, the height of that 2 layers of bricks. So now the next thing is to build this thermal mass. So this is the actual mud, the building material that I'll use for the rest of the project, in a big thick mass. And so when the fire gets built and burns and heats up the fire bricks that make up the oven hearth, it also heats up this big chunk of clay. And this is where after we pull the fire out, all that heat is just stored there and helps us bake for hours and hours afterward. So this could be just rectangular. There's no reason why it couldn't be. I just have access to a machine that allows me to cut big plywood circles pretty easily. There's a CNC router that I have access to. So I just made this mold really quickly. And the reason is that this circle is actually the size of the area that I'll be baking in. So once the oven's done, you'll see that there's a circular footprint to it, right? Like where I put bread and pizza and whatever, it's circular. So this is kind of mirroring the shape of the actual usable part of the oven. The other reason why I did this, you'll see in a moment, but essentially, we fill this with that clay and pack it in there. Again, this is that clay sand mixture, the mud that we use to build everything else. And once it's all packed in there, I kind of flatten the top off again. So we're always kind of keeping this level so that if you ever wanted to bake something, that had some liquid, like maybe you're roasting something in a pan, essentially, the idea is to not have the water spilling out or liquid spilling out. So always trying to keep this level. So once this dried, I started to take the mold off, and you can see I'm left with a trough around there. You can even see a little bit of the bottles poking out. You can see that it's not totally, just to give you an idea where we are now, like look at the level of that moat, and it's almost up to that second layer of bricks. So the next thing to do was add a third layer of bricks, and now we've really got a moat that's going to contain more bottles and more insulation mixture. If I were to make this thermal mass in the middle out of in a square shape, and especially if the bottom of the foundation of my oven was square shaped, it would make sense to just lay bottles in there in the same way that I laid them in before. But since I had this circular moat here that's about the size of the diameter of a bottle, my plan always was to fill this with upright bottles. And so the way that I planned to do that was to cut the bottoms off of wine bottles and place them in there. So here you can see what that looks like. So to cut up the wine bottles, I basically just kind of came up with this really simple jig and scored them with a glass cutter. And I mean, there are tons of methods for cutting the bottoms off of bottles on the internet, because people like to make glasses out of them and things. But I tried them all, and this method seemed to be the way to go. So I just scored them and then brought them over to the kitchen sink, where I dripped boiling water on that line and then dripped cold water back and forth a couple times, and it just would pop apart. So it was pretty good. Then you can see they basically just go face down in here. Again, this is to capture air. This is the insulation. It's also supporting, because I'm going to build this giant clay dome, it also has some kind of structural merit to it. These are actually pretty thick-walled bottles, but and the bottles underneath are all kind of, in a way, supporting a lot of weight up above. So that's the second reason why there's bottles are here. Here it is all kind of filled in, and everything is level at the top. So the next thing was to, I was planning to build an archway for the front of it. And so the next thing was just to try it out. And so I made this kind of wooden form and then built an arch on top of it. And there's pretty good instructions in Kiko Denzer's book. You basically just have these kind of chopsticks. I have these pieces of wood there that are laying on the clay, and basically you have this kind of arch form supported on those little chopstick type things, and then you slip the chopsticks out and you can remove the form, and the arch should stay up. So I took it apart, and you can see the mold. It has like that form. It has a front and a back to it. I'll use that again in a moment. But the idea is next to actually lay down the fire bricks that will become the oven floor, the hearth. So I put some sand down, and the reason for that is so that if I just put bricks down on top of that clay insulation and clay thermal mass, it may just kind of sit on there and have contact at a few points. So what we really want is to be able to transfer the heat from those bricks into that thermal mass underneath. So this is kind of like some kind of, it's almost like filling those gaps so that the heat will transfer downward. So you can see, if you ignore the arch, you can see the oven floor. That's the hearth. Those are the fire bricks. One of the only things that I knew I would have to buy, which they're not that expensive, but conceptually I wanted to stick with all found stuff, but I knew I'd have to buy these. These are very particular. So here's the arch. This is kind of rebuilt. There is a keystone in the middle there. I didn't have to mortar it necessarily, but I was a little worried that when the heat got to it, that it might expand or contract and I'd have some trouble. So at this point, because I had the chopsticks in there underneath and I pulled them out, you can see that there's a gap. It is standing up on its own right now. It's not resting on the wooden form. Unfortunately, I couldn't pull the wooden form out because that keystone had this little thing hanging down. If you look in the center, it just wouldn't allow me to pull the form out. So I just took it apart instead. And that was mainly just to take the front and the back off and make sure that it actually stood up on its own, and it did. So the next step was to just put it back together, and you can see the chopsticks under there again. So the next thing to do is to start building the dome, and the way that works is you make a big sand mound, cover that with clay, and then pull the sand out once the clay is dry, and you end up with a hollow dome. So here it is with wet sand kind of piled up, and the shape is intentionally kind of like an off off-center egg, and the idea is that this shape might be ideal for kind of allowing convection currents to circulate in there. So it's sort of like there's a point that's a little bit further toward the back. So the sand mound represents the actual interior of the oven. So you can see it goes right to the edges of the fire bricks, and the clay will be built around this. Pull the sand out, and that becomes the space that we have to cook. Is this volume that the sand is defining right now? So we're ready to start building the clay wall that goes around this thing. There's Tim on the left who helped me put the clay on the actual sand mound, and on the right is Omri. He and his partner Rotem both were there with their son Ali, and they were doing some stomping of the mud mixture, so mixing the sand, water, and clay that we were going to use to build this kind of coiled up dome. So before the clay goes on there, there's a layer of wet newspaper. It's pretty hot here, so that wet newspaper became dry newspaper pretty quickly, but it wasn't too bad. You know, the idea is if it could stay as kind of a thin newspaper skin that would separate the sand from the clay. When it's time to remove the sand from the inside, we don't want to have all bits of sand sticking to the clay, because then, you know, maybe a month from now when you're cooking, you find that you've got a grain of sand that fell off of the oven and landed in your food or something. So the idea is to have a separation between the clay and the sand. There's Ashton, Tim's son. So this wall goes around in layers, and it's basically, you know, a fist width thick, which is about 3 inches or so, and always pushing downward. So it's getting packed in really tight. And you can see here, as you start getting toward the top, that wall is always going to be. You always want that wall to be perpendicular to that sand mound. So you can see as you get closer to the top, it is more at an angle, and then eventually it just all meets at the top, and you have a complete dome. So here it is from the side. This dried for quite a while, and I had a tent over it, sprayed it with water sometimes. I was trying to get it to dry really slowly, and part of the reason for that was because it started cracking pretty badly. And this, I think, is where I just didn't have enough sand. You could build this entire mound with no sand, just clay, but then you'd have really bad cracking, and that's how I knew that's sort of what the problem was, because I had pretty bad cracking. So I think there was just too much clay and not enough sand. So this is inside the dome. Here you can see these kind of seams that are made with my fingerprints, and that's where I just kind of kept trying to plug these cracks that were happening. You know, I think at some point the oven's going to crack anyway, which is okay. But this early on, I wanted to kind of have it be really pretty structurally sound. So I just kept filling those cracks, kind of squeezing them together. And at some point, I got worried enough that I thought maybe I need to put a bit more clay on the outside. Now, the reason for not putting a really thick amount of clay is because at some point, you know, this is another thermal mass. You're trying to heat this with the fire inside and have it radiate heat throughout the cooking process. But if you make this really thick, then what happens is you're only ever able, in the 2 or 3 hours that you're heating the oven, you're only able to heat so much of that thickness. You're not able to heat the entire thickness. And that remaining part of the wall that didn't really get hot is actually just drawing heat away from the inside of the oven. So the thicker this gets, the worse it can be for the oven. So mine is a little bit thicker than I wanted it to be, which basically just means that I'd have to fire it a little longer each time, which is okay. So I made that kind of scratched surface, and just in the hopes that the next layer would adhere a little bit better than if I just kind of put it on there. So here's another layer. Here it is with another layer put on, and in this case, I'm not really sure. I think I threw in some chopped up pine straw that I had hanging around, just in the hopes that it might help give it a little more stability and not crack as much. So the next thing to do was, I could fire the oven at this point and just see how it works. Without any insulation on the outside of the oven, the heat would leave pretty quickly. So I wouldn't really be able to bake bread probably, but I could cook a pizza. I just thought, I don't want to put a fire in there because it's probably going to start cracking even more. And I knew that I would need an insulation layer on the outside of this. So maybe I thought now is the time to do that before I fire it, and that will also help it maybe keep from cracking too much more. So I took that same sawmill stuff and mixed it with the clay, which you'll see in a moment. But before I did that, I put these sticks in the tops of the top of the dome, so that I knew that that's the height, the thickness that I would want to get to with the insulation. So you see where the dome reaches right now. It's not nearly out to, it's not even out to the ring of bricks. So I knew that building this, that the insulation layer I'd want to be pretty thick so I could bake for a really long time. And so that's why there's so much space there right now to accommodate the insulation layers as they accumulate. So here it is, the clay slip and that mixture of chainsaw stuff. And here it is on the oven. So now you can see it's actually out to the brick. And I think, my plan was probably to stop here. So we've got just the brick showing, and this is a usable oven at this point. So here it is from the front. So I fired it, and here I made a firing door by just rolling a piece of steel and attaching a handle to it. And this worked out great because it's basically letting air in through the bottom, and then it's coming out through the top as a chimney. So I don't know if you can really tell from this picture because it's a weird angle, but this is kind of like a half pipe sort of thing, or a quarter of a pipe. So one of the problems was that as the fire got large, sometimes it would lick out through this opening, and then it would burn that kind of clay and wood chip insulation material. So here you can actually see that it's burned it away enough that you can see the clay layers. And part of the problem too of making a brick arch was that the clay never really wanted to stick to it. So you can see here that the clay is kind of separating from the brick. So it got to the point where you could kind of see heat and smoke and sometimes a little bit of fire trying to come out from on top of the brick, which was not great. So here's a close-up of that just kind of crumbling a little bit. So I was able to bake and or at least cook pizza. We were definitely cooking pizza. There's pizza in there. But I think these initial times, I just wasn't firing it long enough because that extra thick layer of clay in the beginning, it requires a little bit more heat. So I usually fire it for 3 hours now, and that works great. So my plan at this point was to add more insulation, and because you can never have too much insulation, and then also to kind of remedy this problem of the burning insulation that's on there right now. So there are two things going on there. If I wanted to add more insulation, I don't really know how I'd be able to do that because my plan was never to get a bigger insulation layer than this. So when it's okay to have the dome get bigger, but what happens once it gets to the front? It's either going to have to be taper down to no insulation where the brick is, or it would have to somehow suspend itself in the air around that brick arch. So what I thought was by adding another arch, this metal one, I could put the insulation layers that get stuck on top of this, I could add them here and have them rest on that metal arch. So the other thing is I'd add a chimney, and that's mainly because I wouldn't be able to use my firing door anymore. And the other thing is I also thought this would kind of remedy the problem of the fire coming up and licking against the insulation, and it would allow me to use a different kind of insulation that wasn't wood chips. So with all that said, I just kind of tried it out, burned a little bit of a fire. You can see the smoke coming out of the top of the chimney, and a fire. I just want to make sure I wasn't making it so that the fire didn't get enough air or something, but it worked fine. And you can see in the background there, I started collecting firewood. This was right after a hurricane, and we had tons of trees down, hickory and oak and all this other stuff. So I started collecting firewood, and I made a little shack to put it in. I couldn't use my fancy firing door that I was so proud of anymore because it wouldn't sit on the bricks anymore properly. So I just did this, kind of took a pan and held it with a broom, and that worked just as well. But I don't even do that anymore. It usually goes pretty well without any special accommodation. I don't ever need to help the fire along. It just burns right away. So here it is with more insulation, and you can see it's now resting on top of that metal arch. It's not fully covering the arch. It's also fully not out to the edges of the bricks. So I still have room to add even more insulation if I wanted to. And in fact, that's the next thing I did. But this insulation is different. This is a mixture of clay slip and this stuff called perlite, which is this really lightweight volcanic rock. And the reason why it's gray now instead of brown is because I ended up using some clay that was, I teach in the art department at a university, and there was a bunch of porcelain clay that was left over from students, and so I just took some of that and made slip instead of making slip from the brown mud that I had been using. And mixed that with the perlite and then made this other layer of insulation. And you can see it's working. That fire inside's a little bit too big, and I think, what I've learned now is that the fires don't need to be this big. And but as you can imagine, that metal is heating up, and you can see that the insulation is kind of drawing away from it a little bit. There's a little bit of cracking happening, but we're still able to cook fine. So we're making pizza and roasting vegetables and baking bread. So here's some of the first attempts before I really kind of understood anything about bread. I know a little bit more now, and I think the results are a little more predictable now. This is proofing bread in the stoneware bannetons that my wife made, which is pretty amazing. And you can see here that even though it was working fine, we had some cracks in the insulation and some smoke and steam kind of coming out, which is okay. That's not a problem. But it was a little bit of a problem around where the chimney was, that some of that perlite just started breaking off and coming off like little bits of popcorn. So I made one last layer of perlite. Now you can see it goes all the way out to the edge of the brick, and it goes right to the edge of the metal archway, kind of covers the front of the chimney a little bit. It's not 100% ideal because there is some extra heat right here in front of the chimney, so that starts to kind of get a little bit crackly like it did before. But it works. And so here you can also see, it's a little weird because there's a stick next to it, but on the right, leaning against the oven, you can see this rake that I made, just welded a piece of metal onto the end of a pipe. And so it's the rake that I use to pull the coals out after the fire is done in there, after I'm done heating the oven. And it goes into this metal can, and then that's when we're able to sweep and mop out the floor in there and then start baking. So the neat thing that I was kind of excited about with this rake is that since it's a pipe, I kind of made a little hole in the blade part at the end, so it doubles as kind of a blowpipe. If the fire was dying down, I could put this in there and blow through it and add some extra air. So the very last thing I did was to add one more layer, which is lime putty. And this is to give it a little bit of weather resistance. I always knew I'd have to build a roof over this thing if I wanted it to last in Florida weather. And this tent doesn't quite work out. This is really just for building it, but I can't use the tent if it's hot, and because it would just kind of melt, I guess. And since the oven stays hot for over a day after I'm done firing it, there's really a period in there where I can't put the tent over it. And here, where it rains without notice sometimes, I really have to plan ahead and make sure that there's no possibility of rain. All of that's just not realistic. So I knew that I'd have to have a little bit of weather resistance on the dome, especially now that I just had that kind of clay popcorn on there. I definitely needed some protection. And then also I need a roof eventually. So I made this lime putty. This is actually much later after we've been using the oven a bit, because the lime putty actually took about 6 months, I let it slake for about 6 months, which is the longer you can let it slake in water, the better. So then once it's all mixed up with sand and put on the oven, it needs to cure. It doesn't dry, it cures. So here I have a plastic sheet over it, and I'm spraying it with water every day, trying to keep it moist because you don't want it to dry out. You want it to actually cure instead. So here it is, pretty much cured. I see a little bit of spots in there. I think maybe it wasn't mixed as well as it could be with the sand, but it works great. So now you're seeing a couple things. I'm starting to build a roof over it, and it's become really white, and that's because I painted it with lime wash, and this is maybe the first coat, but eventually they would get 3 coats of lime wash so that it has this white surface that's a bit more water resistant. And here's the end. This is the what it looks like now, pretty much. And there's a rain barrel in the back to catch all the water that comes off the roof. You can see that there's some firewood inside the oven, and that's because after we get the heat that we want from the fire, we pull it out, put it in that metal bucket off to the side of the oven, and then kind of get rid of any extra coals. At that point, we have a lot of heat. It's while it's firing, it's 1,300 degrees at the surface of the dome inside, and the floor is maybe 800 degrees. So that's great for baking pizzas. That happens, in a minute. You can bake a pizza. Flatbreads, other things that cook really quickly. And then once it cools down, which we also mop the floor of the oven, and that cools it down a bit too, gets rid of any ash that's left. And then we bake bread, and so should be able to bake several loaves of bread. And then once it gets down to a lower temperature, maybe doing things like baking cakes and cookies, things like that, roasting vegetables. So kind of going with the way that the oven starts to lose heat, but it takes quite a while for it to actually lose all of its heat. So drying seeds and fruit and things like that could happen way later. But at some point, the temperature goes down enough that we just want to steal that last bit of heat, and I fill it with firewood, and that dries out the firewood for the next time. So kind of using all of the heat that the oven has. That's about it. And, I'd say you could ask questions, but before you ask me anything, definitely get that Kiko Denzer book if you plan on doing this. Also, look at Instructables, because just yesterday I saw that someone posted, someone who had made an oven this big had posted an Instructable that showed how to make a very tiny version of it with just like 4 fire bricks as the hearth floor, which seems pretty cool. So that might be a thing to check out if you're interested in building an oven like this for yourself. Thanks.